So I'm Perry, and I am a co-founder of a studio called Studio Above and Below. Our work primarily is within the XR space. For the last 2 to 3 years, we've been producing touring artworks that makes use of live data feeds. These data feeds influence, say, living algorithms or sculptural forms. So yeah, last year we were a part of the festival and we showed a work called Digital Atmosphere, which was downstairs. And this took live pollution data, and this data influenced augmented reality sculpture. But sorry, that was a big intro.
No.
But that's a bit about how we're here, I guess.
Yeah, I'm Daria, the other founder of Studio Above and Below. And yeah, we're excited to talk about digital spaces today, how we source, analyze, transform different environmental data into virtual spaces. And yeah, thank you.
Awesome. I'm Ed. Is this on? Yes. I'm a product manager at Instagram, where I lead all of our efforts on NFTs and blockchain and Web3. Really big emphasis on how can we help creators build communities around their work and develop like meaningful relationships, like direct relationships with their fans and collectors.
Hi. Am I on? Hello? Yep. Hi, I am Sal. I am a creative practitioner performing as a drag queen called The Night Buzz. That's this. I make theatre and performance, and recently gone into the world of digital design through a project with Meta.
Thank you. So I think this is such an exciting topic because it feels like there are so many questions and not really many answers yet. So maybe we'll get some today, maybe we'll just get more questions, I don't know. But it also seems that the metaverse is really something that like design thinking and the designer's skill is going to be crucial to creating. And since we kind of tend to think of design as this mirror of society, I wonder how the metaverse is going to kind of extend this design's capacity to address issues of social justice and inclusivity and kind of impact positive behaviour. So I know it's a huge question to start with, but does anyone want to kind of kick off thoughts about this?
I can take a stab. I think one of the really interesting parts when we think about the metaverse is kind of like what it represents on like our journey as a society. If you think about Web 2, Facebook and MySpace and all of these platforms, it was really about bringing your singular physical identity online. So you brought your real life or offline friendships and relationships online. And so the online design was centered around that. And that was really just, pulling out, like, we have physical spaces like this, and we've aimed to replicate those physical spaces and those physical relationships just online. I think what we're seeing with the metaverse is we're allowing people, or embracing the ability for people to have multiple identities. And so for designers and for creators, that's this really interesting opportunity for expression and for exploring new worlds or exploring new design opportunities with fewer constraints. And so it's just really interesting. We're starting to see this, and I think probably one of the most widely used pieces of design software is not really used probably by many people in this room, and it's Minecraft, probably followed secondly by Roblox. And it's empowering like a new type of design, not necessarily tied to a physical identity, but tied to a unique identity, a unique community. And I think that's that raises a lot of really interesting like responsibility questions, but also opens up so many potentials for exploring new design.
Yeah. So I guess in the metaverse, everyone's intrigued by this idea that everyone is a creator, and there's an element of fantasy to this. Everybody can be someone else. Do you think, whenever people are dropped into a public space, they tend to go and find their tribes. Do you think that sort of as we embrace this digital realm, we might, instead of sort of using it as an open space where people could to break down perceptions about each other, it might actually just sort of create more tribalism and sort of bubble making that we've seen with Web 2.0? Do you want to say?
Yeah, I think I can respond to that. I think, this metaverse thing is still a niche, and in a public space, if, in theory, people were walking around with headsets, I imagine it's not going to be like these advertisement videos of like this one universal way of seeing the public space. Like everybody's gonna probably have their own reality or own overlay. There'll be possibly like groups of people who are acting within the same reality or space. But I think this is like a good thing and a bad thing. It could cause more polarized views, but also, yeah, it could bring people together collectively. So it's kind of a yes or no answer for me.
Yeah.
Don't know.
Hello, I would probably echo that as well. I think it's the lens through which you view that. It could be tribalism, it could be community. Certainly for marginalised intersectional groups, I think any opportunity to sort of find people who have similar interests and ultimately sort of support you to become authentic within those spaces can be a good thing. Irrelevant of which direction that goes following that experience, but certainly for designing in there, whether it's to design for yourself or creating sort of a mystical world that you get to exist in authentically, there is a real possibility in that. I think that can be a really good thing.
Yeah.
Maybe one thing to add on it. I mean, the metaverse, which is still evolving, I think how we see it is also as a world-building tool, as a tool to maybe build other worlds, not a one-to-one translation actually from the real world. And from what I understand, it's also a lot about asset collection, asset building around you, and maybe we can take this as a positive element to not only collect assets to show off, to show our identities. Maybe we can actually come up with new concepts for assets that have a social value, that maybe have an environmental value, and actually together create those other niche groups in this metaverse. So I think thinking about how we could actually, really create different worlds in there. I think to lead to different identities. I think that'd be interesting.
Yeah. And it's this big opportunity to explore sides of yourself, yourself beyond kind of your body as it is in the physical realm. And I wonder, the Night Bus created a costume for Meta. I wonder if you could talk about your experience of that and how it felt to be a creator.
Sure, yeah. So the premise behind this was that Meta were doing a campaign called We're Queens of the Metaverse, where they invited 3 budding designers to use the metaverse and the associated apps to create a costume in the physical and digital realm. So I was one of 3 of the budding designers. I'm a drag queen, having designed for myself. I've never designed for others, and that was very clear from the outset, and that was actually what they'd invited in. It was an opportunity to show how people who weren't experienced in design could use this technology. So I'd been working with a digital designer, Xing, as well, as a costume maker who made it in the physical case, and we were designing for Tia Coffey, who was on Drag Race UK season 2. And it was, I suppose, a quite straightforward design process when it comes to making a costume. You would have a concept, you think about the materials that are going into that, and then you have fittings. But in addition to that was the idea of how AR could be used to bring that dress to life. So the theme that we had was intergalactic goddess. With bringing that to life, the world really is your oyster. What could you bring in there? It's like orbiting planets, the end of the sort of a life cycle of a star. All of these concepts that I've been putting together on a mood board and thinking, actually, the tech, if you viewed that dress at the event at the end of the campaign, what would it look like if you put these filters on it? So that experience, I think the technology was there to facilitate that, and to facilitate that way of thinking, bringing everything together, collaborating with others. There are obviously limitations to that as well. It didn't necessarily replace physically being in the room and having to actually design that and have the fittings and so on. But the experience itself, I think, was really eye-opening. And certainly using apps like Gravity Sketch, which I believe was first designed for car parts, to then use that to design a costume, sort of thinking without purpose and designing without purpose. I find that really fascinating, and it's kind of a nod towards where I think this work could go, doing things without purpose and seeing what comes of it. Isn't that creativity?
And a lot of people are already using the metaverse as a kind of marketplace, right? People are creating their own things, and I feel like also Web 2.0 was the beginning of encouraging us to create our own content. You know, this metaverse or this next phase of internet use is going to depend on user creation. And I wondered, Ed, if you could just explain how that's going to go from, like, at the moment we're creating videos, we're creating memes, how that might translate into creating products and things which were mainly the realm of trained designers, professional designers.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think when you look back over the course of history, every huge creative or artistic revolution has been because of a massive change in accessibility and broadening of the funnel. It's hard to imagine it now, but just a few centuries ago, one of the key limitations on what a person could paint was what colors could be reproduced as a paint. And there's a great book, it's probably actually available in the bookstore, called The Secret Life of Color. And it tells the story of how all of these different colors were created. And it was part science, and it was expensive, and just made the whole medium like really, really inaccessible for people. And then suddenly we got better at that, and more people could paint and depict more complex and wider breadth of scenes. And then, you know, the printing press, obviously, massive accessibility for the written word. And then we get to just 15 years ago when the iPhone comes out, and the fact that it had a camera and was suddenly a portable camera was not even one of the things that Steve Jobs used to introduce it with and to sell it initially. But now it's the main reason why we choose to upgrade our phones. It's because the camera is just so much better. And I think that has just made photography and video making so much more accessible for people. And I think, and that has itself prompted this incredible artistic, you know, revolution, to your point, where everyone can become a creator. And so for the first time, we're kind of in this realm where there is literally just your imagination that is stopping you from creating something and finding an audience for it. And what's been real, I think the main story of this summer has been AI, image generation, stable diffusion, DALL-E 2, like these things are just like really lowering the barrier of entry for people to become creators. And I think that's a huge revolution. And so that's what makes me think like a lot of people are really skeptical of the metaverse, rightly so. I think it's really hard to define exactly what it is, but I think what it definitely is this accessibility of creation on a massive scale in new forms and for much wider breadth of people, which is, I think, really, really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's lowering the barrier of entry to being a creator. A lot of people won't be able to train professionally, won't, be in a part of the world where that's even an option for them. A lot of people won't even know that design is a career. Do you see that these developments could make design more inclusive, accessible, and what's the position of the trained designer in this kind of new realm?
There's definitely, let's say, a shift in using the tools or the technologies also behind the 3D spaces that we actually design. Like all the games engines are now being used by designers to create massive installations, drive different artworks, drive different designs, and that makes it more accessible to create mixed reality experiences, to actually mix a variety of tools like, let's take stable diffusion, put it in a games engine, and actually create something for the metaverse. So actually, the more open access actually to technologies definitely makes it possible also to become a creator maybe more easily. And I would say everyone should get creative, definitely. However, I think being trained in design is still pretty good, like reflecting on those tools really critically, knowing like how can I use all the palette of tools to be used, and designing responsibly. Yeah. I think this is maybe something you learn in university, hopefully, and then afterwards I think that shouldn't be left out.
Yeah. And how do you, because you've obviously mixed, you work across these realms in your studio. So was that something that you were conscious of from the beginning of setting up a studio, that you wanted to work between physical and digital?
Yeah, definitely. Now, like, we've been building this body of work where the outcome's usually a digital experience, but it's really after that digital experience being embodied in yourself and aware of your environment in some way. So how we've used like pollution data, things like soil data, water quality, like experiencing that in a digital space in a new, innovative way, but then after leaving that digital space, being aware of your environment and possibly changing your behavior in some way. I think this is super interesting to us and our work that we're making.
Yeah, but how we started using those tools was actually like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago when AR really popped up, and we were just excited to use those tools like in the very beginning, but weren't aware of what we can actually create with this, and it's just an add-on of like this network of physical, digital elements, algorithms, and that makes it really exciting.
Yeah.
And just to come back to this idea of like identity and your environment being totally something you can construct yourself in the metaverse, how do we, I mean, will people be using this as a form of escapism from the real world? Or they be using it to explore new identities? Like, how will it impact on our mental well-being to kind of have a self which is outside ourselves? How do you think people will embrace that? And how also should we deal with the idea of authenticity in the metaverse? Do we know who we're talking to? We won't have a lot of the tools that we've come to use as humans navigating the real world. Those will be, they'll have to be renegotiated in the metaverse.
Yeah, I think the idea of authenticity, I think, is really interesting. So when we think of authenticity online, we're like, is this person who I'm talking to who they are in the real world? And I think that's kind of our idea, right, of authenticity. I think what's really interesting with this world where you can have multiple identities, you might be a gamer, you might be, a sportsman, you might, whatever you want to be, you might have 5 or 6 different identities. And authenticity changes from, is this person who says they're a 30-year-old white male actually a 30-year-old white male, or are they, 60-year-old woman, like somewhere, like the definition of authenticity changes to be like, are they actually the gamer who they say they are? It doesn't kind of matter who your other identity, who your offline identity is as much. So I think our understanding or how we think about authenticity changes when you start thinking about the metaverse. Like, you think back to the early days of the internet, no one really cared who you were or who you look like in real life. It was all about, what is your contribution to the community that you're in? And are you authentically that person within that community? And I think, the whole point of design of spaces is to bring like-minded people together, whether that's online or offline. Today is a perfect example. A whole bunch of like-minded people have come together. I don't necessarily care who any of you are outside of this room, but what I do care is that you're here and interested in this. That's what's brought us all together today. And so I think it's then how do we keep that safe is kind of, I think, a separate question to authenticity.
Mm-hmm. But, yeah.
Sorry, keeps us mind switching off. There we go. Just coming through to the question about inclusion as well, and trying to sort of imagine decoupling accessibility and inclusion. I think they are very intensely linked. And I think one of the benefits of utilizing this type of technology and thinking about how the metaverse can help things like design is creators will create, they always will. And when we're thinking about people with protected characteristics and how accessible and included they feel when they are using that technology, it allows us to be iterative about that, and that's really helpful. I take myself for an example. I'm a pharmacist. I worked in hospital. I have a PhD in health policy. I'm not from a creative background at all, but I create because it felt like something within me to do that. And I think it's utilizing the tools that are around you to allow you to do that. And also, yeah, having those like-minded people to have those conversations about how do we use this? How do we find the way to use this that isn't its intended purpose? Because that is what artists and designers and creatives do. And so, yeah, having those spaces is really important as well.
And how do we I think a lot of the cynicism about the metaverse is that this is going to be another realm in which we're sold to or advertised to. How can we make sure, we use design skills to kind of make sure that this is a genuinely open platform for everybody? The focus, I think, on Web 2.0 was that it was sort of built and then we were kind of went to inhabit it, but the potential for the metaverse in its early days is that we could all build this together. Do you feel hopeful that that might happen with the metaverse, or do you think, how can it be a genuinely public place rather than sort of controlled by private interests? Do you want to go, Perry?
Maybe try. Just thinking about the metaverse actually is a very physical thing that relies on users or consumers having the technology, as well as like the data centers and things in the background going on. So like, yeah, I think this is a massive thing that has to be achieved before even like users can start using it in a way. We were involved in a project last year, a group show with a company called Journey. They're interested in how they're working because I guess they create metaverses for big brands or for like art shows, but all the like back-end game stuff is happening on a computer remotely.
Okay.
And this is being streamed to a mobile device that a user can move around that space. So it really breaks down the barrier of somebody having to buy the newest iPhone to start using these metaverse spaces. Like it can just be pixel streamed. And yeah, kind of went off the topic of the question, but I thought this was important to bring up.
No, and I think as well, I mean, the ideal idea would be that there's this beautiful, massive platform, and it's really easy to access and really easy to build in and on. And I think the example of Journey, which aims to create that, I think it would be beautiful if it works and if it's generative, so you can actually go there, update things. Things could be influenced from the outside world. Everything would update in real time. So. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of possibilities, definitely. It's important, though, that we, create maybe alternative spaces which can create more meaning, to something that we currently cannot achieve, for example, in the physical world. So I think not just seeing it as a one-to-one translation from the physical world, just digitalizing it, but what are things that we can't currently achieve in the physical world, which we could maybe there. I think that's important to question and to aim together to build that.
Yeah.
I think to go to your question of Web 2 ads, like how do we make sure we're not locked into that? To be honest, like this is why Instagram is interested in blockchain. It isn't because it's the latest buzzword. It is because we want to shift the connection. If you think about Web 2, you each have siloed connections to platforms. So creators have a connection to Spotify. They have a separate siloed connection or relationship with Instagram, and their communities are kind of siloed on those platforms as well. What we look to blockchain to solve is actually creators having a direct kind of platform agnostic connection with their fans and with their community. And so that you can then take that connection and take that community and move across all these different spaces really seamlessly. So I think that's how we do it. I think we find the right parts of the metaverse that should be decentralized and the right parts that you kind of need to be kind of siloed together. And figure out what that mix is. I don't think the answer is that everything is decentralized. I also don't think, as we've seen from Web 2, that the answer is that everything is centralized. I think there's certain parts that should be and shouldn't be. So I think for Instagram, we're really interested in how can we give control back to creators over how they engage with their community, enable them to like span offline and online worlds like really, really easily.
How do we? It seems to be like if we all have multiple identities in the metaverse, how do we design for these different groups if they're constantly sort of shifting and changing? It seems like a hard enough thing to do in the real world to kind of find your user group, really understand them and make sure that you're designing something relevant to them and valuable to them. If things are kind of constantly shifting and this world that we're building seems to be extremely complex, how can we design goods and services for this new sort of realm?
I think one of the things, and Alex, who's one of my colleagues, is in the audience. She knows I say this a lot, but I think we're going to see a rise of the creator a lot more, like in the digital space. Obviously, museums and art galleries have always had this model of like a curation, right, where someone has applied a personal opinion on it, and if you identify with that opinion, then you have found your space and you've found things that you might be interested in. And I think in this world where we have AI recommendations and things like that, there is something to be said for human curation in all of this. And so I think I'm really excited to see how we introduce that curation. And to your point of how you can have some spaces where there might be a more focus on mindfulness or an inclusion, I think curation is going to play a really big role in that. And so people will design kind of their online profiles around their interests, and I think other people will find that interesting. So you're going to have, I think, more and more people kind of curating different experiences, and it's going to be about finding the curator that you identify with as much as it is the individual creator that you identify with.
Yeah.
I think besides that, there will, or there should maybe be also an element of real-timeness, that things actually update in real time, and that could be from actions that you take in the physical world, which get translated. Obviously, it comes up to questions of privacy, which will be an issue, but nonetheless, I think the aspect of actually sensing the real world and translating some of the elements actually into the digital space autonomously, I think that'd be also really interesting.
Yeah. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think just the mention of inclusion as well, the curator who could maybe focus on inclusion, I think there's certain elements that need to be woven through and embedded throughout the entire design process, whether it is for products and services or just essentially how people will be using the metaverse as a space. I think we've got opportunity to learn from how we've used technologies in the past and apply that now. So I wouldn't necessarily, not to sort of disagree directly, but I think having a curator that focuses on inclusion isn't necessarily the most effective approach when we know so much more now within that space that can be applied when we're thinking about what the metaverse means for everyone.
Yeah, it seems that even in the most complex co-creation project, which I guess the metaverse is, there still needs to be some rule setting so that people have something to react to. So obviously Twitter has its character limit, and that kind of set the rules of the game. So even in this sort of like very user-led community that we want the metaverse to be, there will still have to be some structure and social codes that sort of we know very well from real life. How do you think they could be used effectively in a way that doesn't control how the community uses the space, but encourages creativity? Just thinking of like, you know, Instagram has its own formats for how you share information. You can't really go out of that if you want to share something. You're limited to the rules that the platform lays down. Could you just sort of, does anyone have any ideas of how we could sort of have some frameworks that would allow creativity for this sort of co-created space?
Transparency.
Yeah.
It feels really poignant. I think, yes, there are user frameworks that can be developed for being within the metaverse space and using it in whatever way you want to. But ultimately, I think it's very much led by transparency and what is expected. It's transparency, it's literacy as well. We're thinking about how literate are everyone who's going to be using these spaces. Are we accounting for that when it's made available to them? It goes hand in hand with accessibility. I don't think one can move forward without the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's the platforms, obviously, like Meta included, and probably at the forefront of the discussion, have a huge role in place in like what are the foundational things that need to be in place for a safe experience, and that's obviously an incredibly hard thing to achieve, as we've all seen, and I'm sure everyone has an opinion that Meta should have and could have done more in that space sooner. And I think there's a bunch of stuff that we're doing, speaking very tactically, that have learned from our Web 2.0 experiences. And I think one of those big things, like some of the really practical things, like having spaces around your avatar in the virtual world that people can't encroach on, is a really interesting thing to kind of like limit harmful interactions. We're getting really good at, on-device private detection of hate speech. That was one of the projects I worked on before NFTs, is like, how can we do that in a privacy-preserving way? And so I can see woven throughout the decisions that we're making a lot of learnings from Web 2. And a lot of it centers on, we have tools now to keep people safe. We kind of know how bad it can go in some situations. And the answer is, like, in a world where everyone can be connected, that means bad people can connect to good people, and that's something that I think we've learned a lot from. And it's kind of definitely woven into the fabric of how we're thinking about the metaverse and evolving in that space.
Yeah. Do you believe that there's, in creating environments, that in the physical environment we have sort of just the nature of the environment impacts our behaviour. We act very differently if we're in a library to, say, in a nightclub. So if we're constructing these environments, is there the potential to kind of play with how human behaviour changes in that environment?
I was just thinking, I think similar as in the physical space, you probably need some kind of events, some experiences that are actually worth being like revisited. I'm also really curious to see if people actually, you were talking about tribes earlier, like how actually groups build. Is it similar how we have it, on Instagram or Facebook currently, that, I don't know, you follow people, or is it that there are closed groups? Are there experiences that people actually visit together to maybe meet new people? I think one of the interesting things is definitely that you can also probably meet people or have experiences that that are not bound to your physical location currently. So how can you actually, how can you in an experiential way create this network that is interesting to be revisited? And it's a big question. It's still like, I'm really curious, like how it may evolve, how we can, create meaningful and interesting experiences, meaningful discussions in the metaverse that is beyond advertisement or asset creation and so on. I think that's really important, and that's where, I was reading about a project which was like, let's create the natureverse instead of the metaverse, which is, for example, people would collect, instead of NFTs, they would collect actually, projects in the real environment, in the real world, that they contribute to, and this is like their asset collection. And I think, I think more of those ideas could be really interesting to design around. And obviously, this is the conceptual level. There's also the audiovisual level. Like you want a beautiful experience. You want something that's, not only pixelated but really, created in Unreal Engine, so it works seamlessly, looks beautiful, and has this slick 3D environment. I think this is what currently people are definitely driving towards. But how can you not only use those conceptual ideas and also the visual identities and then create those experiences? This is something I still try to figure out.
Yeah. So I guess, what the interface between the physical and the digital will have to be so seamless that people feel naturally that they're not even making a step in between the two. Is that something that you sort of experiment with it in your work when you're using, you're integrating technology with physical experience?
I think so, yeah. I think there's different ways of approaching digital creating as a craft. So sometimes in our practice, or you could think in the metaverse there could be a community who want to sculpt in a certain way using your hands, having this geometry that looks like clay, but also going back to the idea of stable diffusion. I see this kind of the CNC machine or the 3D printer of woodwork or something, because you could spend hours making something, but also you could write a few words and prompt a piece of geometry or a whole environment. So, yeah.
But then on the other hand, you have, we created projects which we used XR goggles actually, and then realized, hey, actually it's interesting, but it's not as accessible. It's actually more accessible if it just happens on an iPad, just on a phone. More people can experience it, and I think all the designs that we create come down to the entry point, which is supposed to be easy, and then you get into the world. So I think there is still the question, how that's going to happen. I don't think we're going to all wear goggles and be in this virtual environment. I also don't think we just want to be on, like, just on the web. Is there a way to cross those boundaries? I think that's,
Yeah.
I think on the one hand, the metaverse and this world of multiple identities is, and you having control over how you show up in all of these spaces, which might be different for every single space, is really good for helping people kind of express themselves in different ways and explore different interests. But I think what we have to be really mindful of is empathy in that space. It's so easy to be mean on the internet. Like, we all know this, right? It's so easy to write a harsh Google review, but if you have to give the same feedback to, you know, the hotel or the restaurant, like, you're going to be a lot kinder because you have that empathy of that in-person interaction. And so I think that's something that we have to be really mindful of, and how you balance those needs. And that's where maybe the digital and the physical crossover can really help. How can you embrace kind of the limitless opportunities that the metaverse has while helping people build empathy? And that empathy comes from in-person interaction and engagement. And it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy to figure out what's the right privacy, environment and controls to have for that. But I think that's kind of the key challenge we're going to have is, I hope that we do not lose empathy and our ability to have empathy for other people.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think at this point it might be nice to ask if there's any questions in the audience for our panel. Does anyone have? Yeah, there's one up there, I think.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you guys. My name is Wan Ki, and I just graduated from the AA school, which is an architecture school. And I just finished my postgraduate design project about community memory. So during the process that we're trying to build a gaming platform about memory, we met up with a very obvious question, is that most of the memories are held in the elderly people. So my question is that when we trying to build a metaverse, it's kind of like a new community. Are we going to leave all the other group of people away and trying to target a small group of young people or those kind of people that love metaverse or the VR headsets? Or we are going to design for the whole age group at the very first beginning? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
That's a great question. I think community happens in so many different places, right? Community does not just happen in one place. If you're a fan of a given musician, maybe you hang out in online forums about them, you go to their concerts, that community travels with you into all of these different contexts. And so I think some communities are going to work really, really well in some spaces versus others. Like, I'd argue we already are living in the metaverse when you have any kind of discussion about a real world event on Twitter or on Instagram or on Reddit. That is the metaverse. It is an additional thing that's laid on top. And so I think communities will decide how far they go. And so communities have the power to layer on kind of an additional, universe, if you will, on top of something that's happening in the real world. So in your example, I think exclusion of people who don't want to put on a VR headset is a really big concern. And it goes back to what I was saying about empathy. And so I think we need to design communities for the people that we want in that community. And so for some people, that's going to mean, hey, it's not going to be in VR. It's going to be in some other space that is far more accessible for them. And so I think it's going to be on a per community basis that we do that. I don't think anyone in this room wants a world where all of our interaction is just with a VR headset on.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? There's one right at the top, but I think a microphone's coming to you.
Hi, I'm Mana, and I'm doing MA Design Management, and currently I'm doing a thesis on surveillance capitalism and data ownership. So I just wanted to ask that, Metaverse is kind of gaining speed, and the data collection, the kind of data, the quality of data that's going to get collected when this becomes a more normal thing, with anyway talks about surveillance capitalism, cognitive capitalism. Do you think the kind of ethics or the kind of design practices that we have especially as a UX designer taking certain decisions while designing applications. Do you think they need to change in a certain way to address to privacy concerns and the way the data is being used by big techs?
So a question of how our data is going to be used and managed in this metaverse. Anybody want to jump in?
I feel that one kind of might be on Meta. This does kind of go back to why Meta is interested in blockchain to begin with. You know, it is because we want people to have direct control over the relationships that they have with others, and for it not to be siloed within one particular place. Blockchain completely upends our concept of data, typically. You know, if you think about data as Europe and the UK sees it with GDPR, data is kind of collected by a body, you know, by a private entity, and that private entity has sole responsibility for it. So if it goes somewhere else, it's kind of on the company. And so GDPR then requires like consent, for example, from the user before it can go to places and be used in certain ways. Blockchain completely turns that upside down. The data is still your data. What you own in your wallet is still your data. It's still personal, but it's public, and it isn't controlled or owned by a single entity. And that, I don't know how we navigate that. I think that's one of the really big things, because privacy and interoperability and control over data are kind of in opposition with each other. On one side, you have a lot of movement around like giving people control over their private data, but then you have another thread on how do we enable people to move seamlessly across different platforms. And that's really hard if you go too far in the privacy direction. But likewise, privacy is really hard if you go too far in the interoperability direction. And so I think the answer is how do you let people keep their data on them, like kind of like a wallet, right? Like that you carry around with you, and you choose in each interaction what you give away, rather than the data being stored in all of these individual places. I think that's where we net out at all of this, but how we get there is going to be really challenging, and I think it's going to really clash over the next 5 years or so.
Yeah, just the kind of anonymized data, I guess, like making data useful, but not giving up our personal
yeah,
data.
It's like you choose when you make it no longer anonymous, if that makes sense, rather than now where it's like you don't necessarily have direct control. You might have indirect control over that, but I think we're getting to a future where you have direct control over when you attach an identity to a piece of data that you own.
Yeah. Okay. One more question. There is one right at the top.
Hi. I wanted maybe to ask for more elaboration on mental well-being, because you obviously said about contribution, but still I kind of really want to ask about what controversial consequences are you considering? Because obviously when it is, when you have like such a possibility of exploring so many identities, there is a risk of kind of being deprived from your actually physical core identity in a way. And maybe also there are like for now any behavioral researches on this kind of issue with metaverse interaction.
So I guess this is about sort of protecting your mental well-being while exploring new identities?
This, and maybe what are the patterns discovered so far in people's behavior in metaverse realm?
Yeah, does anyone want to explore the mental well-being aspect of having multiple identities in the metaverse?
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. I think the opportunity to explore the plurality of everyone in this room, the plurality in these sort of the ways we exist and how we can exist within different realms as well, is something we've already been doing for a while. I think there's something really key and I completely caveat this by saying it is limited experience in the metaverse over 2 months doing a campaign. but the experience of creating and doing and making in the metaverse felt very different to saying, speaking, and showing on other platforms that I'm familiar with. And also because it doesn't currently feel like a replacement. Now, I say that as I'm not a gamer. I didn't grow up playing video games, so I don't escape into those spaces, and I can't speak for people who do. But it certainly didn't, at this stage, feel like it's something that you could step into and go, this can be okay for going forward. It felt like something that was fun, and it felt like an opportunity to be subversive about what was available to you to then use it in a different way. And with that as well is you have scope for collaborating. So even if it is finding those communities that are already put in place for you, or you create your own, I mean, artists will always find a way to create their own anyway. But I think having those collaborators in the space, whether it's the metaverse or not, is also really key for protecting yourself, because it can really facilitate not feeling so alone. But again, personal experience from a limited 2-month project that I did, or 3 months, I don't know. The metaverse has different timings.
Yeah. Does anyone want to add anything?
Maybe just a short thing to add. I think, like, yeah, feelings and these like graphical user interfaces, they're like tightly woven together. So I don't know, there's like that uncertainty that like experiences in the metaverse influence your feelings in some way. And yeah, I think this is still like quite a scary thing, or yeah, I don't know which way it's going to go.
Yeah, I think again this idea of reaching a point where it's more seamless might help, because at the moment it seems there's quite a lot of capacity to be misunderstood online, and trying to find people that think like you. There's quite a lot of capacity to not quite meet, our communication is not quite there online. So again, I guess we'll, as the metaverse develops and we get this kind of more seamless transition of real life to digital life, we might overcome some of that gap.
Just one on mental health. I think Reddit is a really interesting example here, right? Where kind of the practice of, like, there's a Reddit for everything, like literally everything there is a subreddit for. And there's a lot of Reddit, and it's kind of common practice to create throwaway accounts when you're discussing, sensitive issues. And the success of Reddit comes down to Reddit, the platform, providing the right amount of controls, but also allowing each subreddit to have a significant say over how it's moderated, and kind of having that community in that Reddit kind of dictate what content is and is not allowed, and the tone and tenor of discussions that happen on it. And so I think we can hopefully use that as a good model. And yes, Reddit has flaws. Every time you get humans together on any sort of scale, there are going to be some issues. But I think Reddit does provide a really hopeful case in the best scenario of how this could come together, to really help people who maybe don't feel comfortable connecting about a mental health issue in real life, being able to engage with people in the metaverse and in an anonymous and safe space. So I'm hopeful that we can adapt that for the metaverse.
There's definitely something to be said for going online to find someone that had the exact same problem as you, even though if it's a tiny problem. It might be a massive problem. It might just be like, how do I fix this? Somebody help me. And I think the generation who have grown up with the internet are very comfortable using it in that way, right? Just like, I'm not going to ask my neighbor, I'm just going to find my neighbors online, in the kind of virtual sense. But thank you. I think that is all we have time for in this session. We have 2 more sessions this afternoon, so I'm sure we're going to get to grips with loads of these big questions and everything in between as well. But for now, thank you very much to our speakers. It's been really, really interesting, and they've been very open and honest. Thank you.
Thank you.